Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and today marks the first installation of our 2024 Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Today you will hear from Dr. Andras Lacko to my right, and he will share his experiences as a child in Hungary during the Holocaust, and they're really quite interesting. Before we begin, I would like to thank our community partners for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series, SMU Human Rights Program, Texas Holocaust, Genocide, Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. We are so grateful for their support of the museum and our programs. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, and volunteers in the audience. We couldn't fulfill our mission without you. If you are interested in becoming a member or volunteer here at the museum, please visit our website, dhhrm.org, to learn more. I also want to give out a shout out to our summer interns who started a couple of weeks ago, several of whom are joining us here today. In just a moment, Dr. Lacko will share his story with you. Then we will have time for questions and answers. If you're joining us in person today, you should have received a little golf pencil and an index card when you walked in. You can use that card to write any of your questions out on, and we will have staff coming around when Dr. Lacko finishes his remarks to pick those up so that he can answer those questions. I would also mention to those of you who are joining us virtually, so from home, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions, and we will feed those into the question and answer section as well. I would like to ask you at this point to silence your phones, and children who are next to your parents, help them silence their phones. I know you guys know how to do it, so I appreciate that. And please refrain from recording the presentation. It is being recorded, so it will be available online on our YouTube channel in a few days, but that's how we do an official recording. And it is now my great pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Lacko.
Thank you, Sarah. Even though I've been doing this for a couple of years now, it's always a great privilege to give this presentation and engage with the audience after that, answering your questions. The presentation I'm giving is titled The Holocaust in Hungary. Usually survivors are called upon to tell their story, which is going to be part of my presentation, even though it's going to be a small part, because the time frame is such that the Holocaust in Hungary was very much abbreviated compared to the total of the Holocaust, which essentially began in 1938 with Kristallnacht in Germany and lasted until the end of the Second World War, which was in May 1945. Nevertheless, the shortness of the Holocaust in Hungary did not spare the Jewish population from the horrors and the cruelty of the Holocaust as such. We just had a mini tour of your upper floors here. And even though I've been here before, of course, there was one table on the wall that listed the number of Jewish people who perished in Europe during the Holocaust, Poland being number one, close to 3 million Jewish citizens of Poland who perished. Second was Ukraine with 680,000. And Hungary was in third place in 665,000 Jewish citizens that represent somewhere around 3/4 of the Jewish population of Hungary at that time. This was really quite an accomplishment of the Nazi regime, who actually invaded Hungary in 1944, despite the fact that Hungary was one of their allies. And with the technology that they developed in their death camps, they managed to kill the 665,000 Jews, most of them in Poland, in the camps, in about 2.5, 3 months, which is probably a world record in the history of the world as far as the extermination of number of people in the amount of time that was available for them. So with that, I will begin with the background of our family and just see where we came from and see how we actually ended up in the clutches of the Holocaust and how our fate actually developed. You see my picture at 1 year old on the far left. That was in 1937. My parents' wedding picture, 1934, is in the middle. And a larger family gathering of my mother's family on the right. That was also in 1934, preparing for my parents to get married. We, as most of the Hungarian Jews who actually lived in the capital city, Budapest, have been very fortunate because most of the people you see on the right in the family picture actually survived the Holocaust. There were only 3 people, and I'm going to try to point to them if I can find this. This gentleman right there, his daughter here, and their mother who fell off the picture to the left here, I guess. Actually, her husband are the ones. 3 out of about an extended family of 25 were the only ones who actually were killed during the Holocaust. The gentleman in the corner, my mother's uncle, and his daughter were taken to Auschwitz, picked up on the streets of Budapest in June 1944, and then we never heard from him again. And the lady's husband was in a military corps that was attached to the Hungarian and the German military to help out. He had to report to what used to be Yugoslavia, and he never made it back. He was killed in the winter months of 1944. So what I'm really trying to emphasize here that the Hungary in the Holocaust was quite different. Quite different from what happened in Poland. You saw pictures, Schindler's List, number of other. There were many, many pictures that were made of the Holocaust. So what happened in Hungary is most appropriately characterized by what we can see on this map. This is the map of Hungary at the time of the Holocaust. The city of Budapest is shown in the middle. And this city at that time already had closely a million inhabitants. That was one of the few world-class places in Hungary. The rest of them were mostly rural. And as you can see from the small dots, which represent synagogues on the map of Hungary, that is where most of the Jewish population lived. I identified a place called Szatmár in the northeastern corner with the second arrow on the upper right. And you see a rather heavily populated area where a lot of Jews lived. Quite a few of those managed to escape actually to the United States. And they have towns around New York where some of them are located now. So the point I'm really trying to make is that 3/4 of the Jewish population in Hungary was quite dispersed, just like the synagogues are, as you can see. And unfortunately, the people who lived in those communities were nearly all exterminated, killed, and a very small percentage of this rural population of Jewish citizens in Hungary actually made it back and were able to come back to the place where they used to live. And in contrast, the capital city, Budapest, which is again identified on this map, was a much better place for survival. Unfortunately, that is myself and my family, most of our family lived, and that is why a very high percentage of my relatives managed to survive. So I'm going to go back to a little bit of family background here, just to illustrate that at the time these pictures were taken, which is between 1940 and 1942, the Jewish population really could not feel anywhere near the full impact of the Holocaust, which is really striking about that at the same time, the Jewish population of Poland, nearly 3 million Jews, were being exterminated, and by 1942, not many of them were alive. The Jewish population in Hungary, not only in the capital city, but even in the surrounding areas, actually were living their lives more or less normally because Hungary was an ally of Germany. And even though there were Jewish laws against the Jewish population, separate laws, restrictions, even in Hungary, the life of Jews was actually not immediately threatened. This was not true for the rest of Europe, or even for Western European populations of France and Germany and other places were threatened severely, and only a relatively small fraction survived. So what do you see here? On the left side, you see my kindergarten class, and the most prominently featured individual happens to be in a devil's costume, which was me, probably appropriately dressed in such an attire. Considering my activities at home and elsewhere, my parents could certainly testify that I deserved to wear the devil's attire. There are other costumes represented here among the children, and everybody had to recount a little rhyme. And the rhyme I recounted in Hungarian, I was about 4.5 years old, was trying to scare everybody because I was the devil and I was going to take care of you. Well, I also have apparently some musical talents. A couple of years later, I started taking piano lessons. Here I'm displaying my drummer skills, and on the far right, I was allowed to get anywhere near the radio, which otherwise was totally off limits because my parents were quite afraid that I could destroy whatever the radio could do very shortly. In any case, we lived a normal life until March 19, 1944, at which time the German army actually invaded Hungary, which is somewhat unusual considering Hungary, as I mentioned, was an ally of Germany. And by that time, thousands, tens of thousands actually, of Hungarian soldiers died in Ukraine and in Russia during the Russian invasion, during the German invasion of Russia, which began in June 1941. Nevertheless, again, I'm just emphasizing that we were living nearly normal lives, even that late into the Second World War and into the Holocaust. Unfortunately, the rest was not so comfortable. This is a timetable as to what transpired, and this is now starting with the German invasion, when the Jewish population became highly vulnerable in Hungary. Adolf Eichmann, whose name you might have heard, German officer whose major, if not the only role in the German army, was to organize the extermination of the Jewish population, actually came into Hungary and began his work. And as I mentioned earlier, his work was highly efficient. Most importantly, it was also aided by the Nazi-leaning Hungarian population that also helped the rounding up of the Jews, especially in the outlying rural areas where most of the Jewish population lived. So, March 1944, the Germans invaded Hungary, occupied Budapest and the rest of the country. Much more severe laws and regulations against the Jewish population became official. We had to wear a yellow star. Preparations were made for the Jewish population to move into special houses, and this was all a preparation for concentrating the population more and more, just like it happened in Poland, to be prepared for the transportation of the camps, especially the death camps, and basically preparing the Jewish population in Hungary for extermination, which was the written goal and committed purpose of the Nazis as well as their Hungarian supporters. So, my family and 17 faculty members moved into a house which was just a few buildings down from the apartment building where I was born. And this is where my cousin and her parents lived. And this is where our extended family of 17 people got displaced into a 2-bedroom apartment. You see the entrance of the house, which was actually a much later picture. It's been cleaned up since the war. And the door that you see here was actually the entrance to my father's grocery store, which opened up right after the Second World War, since the original store that my parents owned that was down the street this way was actually bombed out. And that's where my parents opened up a store after the war and actually did very well. So moving on with the Holocaust story, October 15 was a very important date in 1944 that impacted the Jewish population. Even though, as I mentioned earlier, most of the Jewish population was already exterminated in the death camps, like Auschwitz particularly, which is now in the territory of Poland. Transportation of the Jews was under the most horrible circumstances. That's why upstairs you see the train tracks and the railroad cars. People were put in for a trip that lasted about a day and a half. They were squeezed into these railroad cars like animals. There was barely any food and even hardly any water and no facilities. And significant number of people actually died during their transportation to the death camp, where they were quickly separated into the older and the very young, who were immediately put to death, and some of the rest of the people were put to work in forced labor camp. So that already happened by October 15. What happened during October 15, that the Hungarian government collapsed, and even the semblance of any independence of Hungary from Germany disappeared. A virulent anti-Jewish government put in place of the earlier government that was also anti-Semitic to quite a degree, but not to the extent that these neo-Nazis were able to do. There were groups of teenagers that didn't even know how to use a gun. They had machine guns on their shoulder, and they were herding the Jewish population into an even smaller area that is actually shown right here. This was the ghetto, which was originally a heavily Jewish district, but the Jewish population of Hungary, which numbered about 200,000, was squeezed into about an 8-city block area. And the plan was, because there were no trains running anymore, the Germans didn't have the trains even to transport their troops, let alone have the ability to transport people into death camps. In this Jewish ghetto that was established late in 1944, the plan was to surround this 8-city block area with explosives and blow it up to eliminate even the final remnants of the Jewish population. So that's what happened on October 15. This Arrow Cross group that you might have heard about became the government. And they were extremely cruel, highly anti-Semitic, and unfortunately quite effective in taking care of the Jewish population the best way that they knew how. One of the ways that they continued the extermination of Jews was by lining them up by the bank of the Danube, and you can see the shoes which commemorate the killing of Jewish citizens who were actually machine gunned into the water. And tens of thousands of Jews who were left over actually found their death by being shot into the Danube and drowned. So this was the Arrow Cross, possibly the most horrible group, one of the most during the Holocaust, that tried to eliminate Jewish population in Europe, and if they had the opportunity, they would have done it all over the world. So now I'm going to switch to my personal story, at least for a little while, and show you my mother's picture in 1944, which was quite different from her picture on her wedding day that you may remember. And the reason she had to change her identity, because otherwise she would have been taken to Auschwitz or another one of the death camps, and she would not have been able to survive the Holocaust. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how this came about, but that's my mother's picture. You see my picture underneath her, and to the left of my picture is my father's certificate, who was at that time in the labor battalions. He was recruited into this group that were building roads or cleaning up roads and doing support work to help the army functioning. He already got drafted into this in 1943. He had to leave home, so he was actually away from us during all that time. Late 1944, my mother went into hiding, and she could not afford to have me with her, because then she would have been discovered that she was Jewish. So I had to be on my own, and I was actually taken to a Red Cross camp where there were a large number of Jews that were being ready. They were being ready to move into the ghetto that I showed you, and actually that's right there on the left. I showed you that earlier. And about November 1944, I was taken to this Red Cross roundup place where, with a friend of mine, we only had a place to sleep in a china cabinet for 3 days, and we couldn't even stretch out our legs. Our legs had to be drawn up against our chest to get into this china cabinet. After several days, all the people who were taken to this roundup center were taken to the ghetto, which I mentioned to you earlier, was designed to squeeze 100,000 Jews into that were still left alive from the Hungarian Jewish population. And the ultimate plan was to surround this place, this area, with explosives and blow it up. Thank God this plan did not materialize. What happened was that the Russian army, the Red Army, beat the Germans to these plans and managed to push into Budapest and occupy it and keep pushing the Germans to the west. So most of the Jewish population of Budapest, the capital city of Hungary, where I was born, actually survived. So what about my story? Well, at this roundup place where we were getting ready to be taken to the ghetto, two young men, even though they were teenagers, they were old, quite a bit older than me. I was 7 years old at the time. One of them was 12 years old, the other one was 19. The three of us were discovered to have a disease called scarlet fever, which is essentially extinct today, at least in the United States, because of the highly effective vaccination effort that babies undergo shortly after they are born. Nevertheless, at the time, 1944, there was no such thing. Scarlet fever was rampant in Europe. Epidemics often broke out. And I was one of the patients who contracted this disease. And as it turned out, this might have saved my life, because the extent of the disease that I had was very, very small. I had a very light case, even though this disease could come with very serious ear, brain, and lung complications that could be fatal. I had only a very light fever all the way through, and basically except for the red dots all over my body, I had no other symptoms. So how did this help? Well, scarlet fever happens to be an extremely contagious disease. So in this roundup center where we were taken by the Red Cross, there were only the three of us who got the disease, and all of a sudden everybody was afraid of us. We were put into a separate room, and when these Hungarian Nazis, who were vicious in every other ways, came to take people to the ghetto, they barely broke the door open and looked, and they immediately walked away because they were afraid also of getting the disease. So I was left in this roundup center and then was transported to the hospital, which was one of the most modern hospitals in Hungary. As you can see the picture, the bottom of this slide. A wing of this hospital was reserved for the military, with also having scarlet fever, and that's where I was taken. We were given, even in those days when food was becoming scarce and there was a lot of problems with shortages, we were having 3 meals a day and medical care, and until the end of the year, I was treated very well for about 6 weeks. Certainly, I survived with no problems. Now, then, of course, the fighting began. The Red Army, as you see, the Russian soldiers on this picture, they were beginning to push to the west. They got into the city, and this hospital was on the outskirts of the city, so this was one of the first areas that was liberated by the Russians. Along with the liberations came some problems. The hospital staff left, and from one day to the next, hospital patients, us, discovered that there was no food, no service, nothing. We had to fend for ourselves, and we had to find ways to survive. So 2 boys and myself decided that we were going to get on the street and see if we can walk home. And actually, that's what we did. And here is the track of our journey, along with a couple of other pictures. You can see the extreme devastation that occurred during this fighting. On the left is a royal palace, which was nearly totally destroyed. Interestingly, it's been now restored to its old glamour, and it's a beautiful place. But at that time, it was severely damaged due to artillery and some aerial bombardment. On the right, you see what is called a chain bridge, which was also blown up like all other 7 bridges over the Danube by the Germans. They were hoping to prevent Russian advances, which didn't help much, but at least slow down the Russians' westward march to a point. The bottom diagram shows the journey that the 2 boys and myself undertook, and this was quite a long journey, about 10 miles. Doesn't sound like much of a distance. About 20 years ago, occasionally, I actually went out for a jog with my colleagues, and we did 10 miles on the weekend. Those days, this was not quite as easy. For one thing, there was fighting going on. For another, this was one of the coldest winters in memory in Hungary, where minus 20 degrees was not at all unusual. I had a little episode that made my journey even more difficult. Along the way, during this journey. I guess I don't have this picture. There was a factory that used to make tractors and ships and transportation vehicles, and the two boys and I ended up in the basement of this factory. As it turned out, the Russian soldiers also found refuge in this basement, and I had all my belongings, including a pair of pajamas and a couple of shirts and underwear in a bag, which I put on a bench next to me. The next few minutes, they brought in a Russian soldier who was injured. He was a casualty, and he bled all over the place of my clothes, so I no longer had anything except what I was wearing. So during this 10-mile journey, I had to beg, borrow, and somehow managed to keep going. As we proceeded, the two boys dropped off at earlier distances because they found a place where they used to live, and they reunited with their families. I ended up over here, not too far from the place where I used to live. Unfortunately, I ran into another obstacle. I developed a serious case of dysentery, probably because all the crazy stuff that I was eating, whatever people were giving us to eat along the way. This was about a 4 or 5 day journey, and we found refuge and things to eat where, whatever the goodness of people allowed us. I ended up being taken in by a young couple here with the dysentery, which was very serious, and they nursed me back to good health in about 2 days. They told me if I cannot find my parents, I should go back to them because they wanted to adopt me. Fortunately, this was not necessary. When I took the last leg of the journey by myself, which was only about a mile, I ended up across the street from where I used to live in a basement, and the lady who used to do our laundry found me and gave me something to eat and drink. The next day, my mother arrived, so we were united, at least the two of us. A few months later, my father found us, and remarkably rapidly after the war, we found our way back to live a normal life. So what was a normal life following the war? Well, you see my identity papers on the left here. When I was 18 years old, and this is stamped by the Canadian government because that is where I ended up. Decided to escape Hungary in 1956 after a revolution that took place in Hungary, and for at least a week or 10 days had a democratic government instead of the communist rule that the Soviet authorities imposed on Hungary. Well, that's another story, and I don't want to digress. But anyway, that's what that document says. On the right, you see a briefcase which held all my belongings that I took from Hungary to Canada. In 1963, I came to the United States as a graduate student at the University of Washington, and the rest, as they say, is history. So you see my picture on the streets of Vancouver, and the green arrow shows my journey that was actually sponsored by the Canadian government from Vienna to Montreal and eventually to Vancouver. This is what happened to my extended family after the Holocaust and after my journey to this continent from Hungary. First of all, I think it's interesting to point out that on this picture, except for my wife and I, who is in the audience here, and my second cousin, who is here, settled in Sweden, and her 2 children. Again, myself, my wife, whom I can't find on this picture at the moment, and my cousin. We are the only 3 people who are still declare ourselves to be Jewish today. All the other people, because my first wife, whose children are also in this picture, 4 children, none of them are Jewish, and the people in Sweden are not Jewish either. So basically, we lost our historical base, we lost our ancestry, and again, because of the Holocaust and other consequences, we were not able to establish the kind of family that we were hoping to do. But as they say in French, c'est la vie. So, this is the end of my presentation. We live in rather difficult times in the last few months, especially regarding Jewish citizens of this country. You might have seen events on television that are hardly beneficial or encouraging. So there's no time like the present to remember the Holocaust and try to evaluate the consequences and see how we can prevent not only the killing of people, but the severe discrimination and hatred of other people, so that the circumstances that came after the Holocaust and were the result of the Holocaust, including 6 million dead, would not happen again. So we have a session now to deal with some of the questions you may have, and I would be certainly pleased to attempt to answer those. Thank you.
Okay, I have some of the starting questions from online. Those of you who have written questions on your index cards, please just hold them up and staff will be around to collect them. Hold on one moment, I want to make sure that staff is coming down to collect. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I will start with the questions we've gotten so far. The first question is, when did you start sharing your story and why did you start sharing your story?
Well, I shared my story with my children, of course, from early time, and my youngest child was born in 1967. I even shared my story earlier, informally. In 1992, my mother and I had a request from the Shoah Foundation that was founded by Steven Spielberg and have a repository of interviews at the University of Southern California. In 1992, we were invited to record testimony And I have copies of this, and that was the first formal opportunity to share.
What drove you to actually share it publicly? What was your motivation?
What was my motivation? Well, I certainly saw the value of letting people know what other people are capable of, and provide a warning that it's probably a good idea to try to look into these stories and see how we might prevent them, because this is not what most of us consider humanity is about. Whether we are religious or not, I don't think that our purpose is to try to go back thousands of years where sometimes people had to kill each other to have enough food and so on. So the idea of treating our fellow human beings with respect and allow them the same opportunities that we were given is a worthwhile enterprise.
Okay, thank you. The next question is as follows. When the Russians invaded Budapest toward the end of the war, what were the conditions like in the city? Was there any food left, and when did people begin to rebuild the city?
Well, the conditions in Budapest during the Russian invasion were horrible. People were seen, and I've seen them myself, cutting up dead horses in the street and trying to get the meat to eat. I mentioned earlier that this was the coldest winter in memory, so at least the horses were frozen and the meat was not spoiled, but other than that, it was rather difficult to get food on the table on a daily basis.
Okay. And the other part of this is when did people begin to rebuild the city?
Well, the city got gradually rebuilt. It is still not 100% rebuilt today, but I was mentioning to someone I was talking earlier that for the purpose of accommodating tourists and have the revenue from tourist traffic, the government has restored a lot of the monuments, hotels, buildings, statues, so that the city is quite attractive today, possibly even more attractive than it was before the war. But it took decades to really bring it back to normal appearance.
Okay. This person wants to know, did you have any long-term effects from your bouts of scarlet fever and dysentery?
I'm not aware of any.
You were lucky. This is a comment from somebody, and then we'll go on to the next question. The comment is, thank you so very much for speaking to us today. And they sent a heart sign, and they say, I am inspired by your story and spirit. Okay, next question. Do you know what government or group ran the military hospital you stayed at?
Well, the government of Hungary, as I mentioned to you, even though they were anti-Semitic and they were allied in Nazi Germany, for the population within the country, they kept a reasonable order, and certainly they were not promoting extermination of Jews, which was not nice, but certainly a huge difference from what the Nazi Germany was doing with the Jews of not only their country, but the rest of Europe as well.
Did you or your parents think of the people that you knew in Budapest differently after the war than from what you had before the war?
Well, it's hard for me to make adult comments because my parents were not openly sharing a lot of their opinions. In fact, one of the favorite tricks that they used when they didn't want me to understand what they're talking about, that they switched to German. And that was very successful. Nevertheless, there were some people that identified themselves during the late months of 1944 as being anti-Semitic, and they certainly had those people marked, but they were not close friends of ours.
This person would like to know if you've ever reconnected with the two boys you walked the long journey with, or the couple that took you in.
Unfortunately, I have not had the opportunity to do so. Life became fast and furious in 1945, and things happened very, very fast. And frankly, we didn't even know exactly what happened during the Holocaust, except my mother's first cousin and her father never came back. But as far as the magnitude of what really the Holocaust was about, we had no idea until some of the newspapers started running series and witness testimonies about personal experiences. And so the approach was to try to forget as soon as possible and try to get on with life. And my father reconnected with the soccer games that he used to love to go to, and we used to go every Sunday, and on and on and on. So we really were just not thinking about what happened.
You said that life in pre-war Germany was mostly normal. What little things were different for Jews?
Well, what was different for Jews, that even from the late 1920s and 1930s, Jews were not allowed to work in the film industry. So guess why they ended up in Hollywood? A lot of them.
They were driven out of Hungary.
That's right.
Okay.
And there were things like that. The university admissions were limited. It's called the numerus clausus. And Jewish doctors, after the treaty between Austria and Hungary, which is 1867, were just growing like mushrooms. I mean, the medical profession was probably 30, 40, maybe 50% made up of Jewish doctors in Hungary. And after the First World War came regulations that in medical school, they only accepted medical students, Jews as medical students in proportion to what they represented in the population. There were other areas of industry and business, and they certainly were not allowed in politics. So there were restrictions, but that did not seriously impact the lifestyle and the freedom of movement or freedom of living, really, in any way.
This person wants to know, it's a two-part question. Have you ever revisited Hungary? And have you visited other sites in Europe where the Holocaust took place?
I visited Hungary many, many times, probably 15 times since I left. I had relatives there. I still have a couple. And so we've been making fairly regular trips. I visited Berlin, where there is also a pretty impressive Holocaust museum. And I saw a couple of other places in Germany that have artworks displayed related to the Holocaust. So I have seen at least those areas.
So we have quite a few young people in the audience today. What advice would you want to leave them with?
Regarding what?
Anything. The floor is yours. Just keep it G-rated.
Well, judging from my children's behavior, they all felt like it was a good idea to study. And 3 out of my 4 children have university degrees. The fourth one, who is probably most successful, only took a couple of years of college courses. But to learn something that you can turn into a career is a very good idea to think about as early as possible. And I did that when I was a teenager, and I actually ended up doing what I was thinking about when I was a teenager, which is kind of amazing by our current standards here. But that would be the most important. Not only that you have to be a bookworm, but the attitude that you pick up as you study the topics that you like and you're attracted to will certainly keep you away from a lot of the crazy stuff that's going on today, including people getting out on the street and demonstrating about things they have no idea what it's all about. So I think finding a purpose and work toward it, preferably including some reading and studies, is a good idea.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon and listening to Dr. Lacko and his testimony. If you would like to ask him questions yourself, or if you'd like to take a photo with him, you're welcome to briefly chat with him after our program. Our next summer speaker will be on June 28th and will feature second-generation survivor, meaning she's the child of survivors, Lisa Kanarek, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.